The fastest way to discover a person's true worth is to take away everything they have and watch what they choose to give anyway. Rain poured over downtown Boston with enough force to blur the towering glass walls of Hayes Technologies into pale gray reflections. Employees crowded beneath the front entrance canopy, pretending to check their phones while secretly watching the humiliating scene unfolding outside. Daniel Brooks walked through the revolving doors carrying a plain cardboard box that held 20 years of loyal work reduced to a family photograph, a coffee mug with his daughter Sophie's hand-painted fingerprints, and a faded notebook filled with engineering ideas no one would ever see. Two security officers followed several steps behind, not because Daniel had resisted, but because company policy demanded a public escort for anyone accused of stealing confidential data. The whispers spread faster than the rain. Some people looked away in embarrassment. Others quietly accepted the story they had been told. Daniel didn't either. He simply tightened his grip on the box and kept walking. High above the lobby, inside an executive conference room overlooking the city, Victoria Hayes watched through the floor-to-ceiling windows without letting anyone see the uncertainty in her eyes. Only 3 weeks earlier, she had become chief executive officer after her father's passing, inheriting a company admired around the world and a board of directors eager to test every decision she made. The investigation report lying on the polished conference table identified Daniel as the employee responsible for leaking sensitive research files. Every signature, every timeline, every recommendation pointed to the same conclusion. Victoria had a proved determination that morning, believing she was protecting the company. Yet as she watched Daniel leave without shouting, arguing, or demanding another chance, something about his quiet dignity unsettled her in ways the report never had. Outside, the cold October wind cut through Daniel's soaked jacket as he crossed the busy sidewalk. His wallet contained just enough cash to buy dinner for himself and Sophie after picking her up from her neighbor's apartment later that evening. He stopped outside a small neighborhood diner where steam drifted across the fogged windows. The smell of homemade chicken soup reminded him that Sophie always smiled when dinner was warm after a difficult day. He stepped inside, counted the few bills in his wallet, and ordered one large container to take home. As he pushed open the restaurant door, he noticed an elderly woman sitting alone on a rain-soaked bench across the street. Her thin coat offered almost no protection from the cold, and her hands trembled as passing strangers hurried by without making eye contact. Daniel looked down at the warm container in his hands, then back toward the elderly woman. Without hesitating, he crossed the street, removed the lid, and placed the steaming meal gently into her hands. "You need this more than I do," he said with a gentle smile. The elderly woman looked up, surprised not only by the meal, but by the kindness in his voice. "What about your own dinner?" she quietly asked. Daniel shrugged, as though the answer required no thought at all. "My little girl would rather know her dad helped someone than came home with an extra bowl of soup." The woman studied his face for a long moment before accepting the meal with grateful eyes. Daniel apologized because he could not stay longer. Sophie would be waiting, and he refused to let one terrible day become 2 disappointments. He turned, adjusted the damp cardboard box beneath one arm, and disappeared into the evening rain without asking the woman's name or expecting anything in return. Several hundred feet away, a long black luxury sedan rolled silently to the curb. A sharply dressed chauffeur stepped out carrying a large umbrella, but remained perfectly still until the elderly woman gave the slightest nod. As Daniel vanished around the corner, the woman watched him with quiet admiration and whispered only one word that no one else could hear. Finally, 3 months earlier, life followed a rhythm Daniel Brooks had learned to treasure because it belonged entirely to him and his 7-year-old daughter. Their small white house in a quiet neighborhood outside Boston was never luxurious, but every room carried the unmistakable warmth of a family that chose gratitude over comfort. Every weekday morning began at 5:30. Daniel brewed fresh coffee while pancake batter sizzled gently on an old cast-iron skillet that had belonged to his late mother. Before waking Sophie, he slipped a handwritten note into her lunchbox. Some mornings it contained a joke. Other mornings, it reminded her that kindness always mattered more than popularity. Sophie saved every note inside a decorated shoebox beneath her bed because she believed one day she would read them to her own children. At 7 o'clock, they climbed into Daniel's aging pickup truck and drove toward Jefferson Elementary. Sophie always insisted on choosing the music, usually cheerful songs that made Daniel laugh despite pretending to object. Before she climbed out each morning, she repeated the same promise. "Do your best today, Dad." Daniel answered exactly the same way every time. "You first." 20 minutes later, he arrived at Hayes Technologies, one of the country's fastest-growing medical innovation companies. As senior systems engineer, Daniel had earned the respect of technicians, security staff, and junior engineers alike because he solved difficult problems without taking credit that belonged to others. If someone stayed late to finish a project, Daniel stayed too. If a new employee struggled, Daniel quietly helped without making anyone feel embarrassed. His office was small, his clothes were simple, and his ambitions rarely reached beyond providing a peaceful home for Sophie. On the top floor, Victoria Hayes stepped into the executive boardroom, carrying responsibilities that had arrived far faster than she expected. At 37, she had inherited the leadership of Hayes Technologies after her father's unexpected passing only weeks before. Investors questioned whether she possessed enough experience. Senior executives constantly offered advice that sounded helpful while quietly protecting their own influence. Victoria rarely allowed anyone to see the pressure she carried. She believed confidence was part of the job, even on days when uncertainty followed her into every meeting. That morning, she crossed the engineering floor for the first time since becoming chief executive officer. Most employees stood politely as she passed. Daniel remained beneath an open server cabinet, replacing a damaged network component that threatened to delay an important research project. He noticed Victoria only after finishing the repair. Wiping his hands with a clean cloth, he offered a respectful smile and a simple greeting before returning to work. Victoria paused for only a second, quietly surprised that someone had treated her like an ordinary person instead of title. She continued walking without another word. Yet she remembered the engineer who seemed more interested in solving problems than impressing executives. That afternoon, Daniel picked Sophie up from school and stopped at their favorite neighborhood grocery store. Sophie spotted an elderly customer struggling to reach a carton of soup on the highest shelf. Before Daniel could react, she carefully climbed onto the lowest step of the display, retrieved the carton, and handed it to the smiling woman. "My dad says helping people should never depend on whether someone is watching," Sophie explained proudly. Daniel smiled with quiet embarrassment while the elderly woman thanked them both. Neither of them noticed another shopper standing several aisles away beneath a baseball cap and oversized coat, watching the simple exchange with thoughtful eyes before quietly disappearing through the automatic doors. As autumn settled over Boston, Hayes Technologies prepared for the largest product demonstration in its history, a breakthrough medical platform expected to attract investors from across the country. Every department worked longer hours, and every mistake suddenly carried greater consequences. Daniel Brooks became the person everyone quietly depended on because he remained calm when deadlines became overwhelming. If a server crashed, Daniel restored it. If software refused to communicate with laboratory equipment, Daniel stayed until the problem disappeared. More than once, younger engineers suggested that he deserved a management position, but Daniel always smiled and answered the same way. "Titles do not build great products. People do." His words earned respect from coworkers, although not everyone appreciated the admiration he received. Richard Coleman, the company's chief operations officer, noticed how often employees sought Daniel's advice instead of his own. Richard had spent years climbing the corporate ladder and believed loyalty should always flow upward. Daniel's quiet influence irritated him because it could not be controlled. During executive meetings, Richard frequently dismissed engineering concerns as unnecessary delays, while Daniel politely insisted that patient safety mattered more than speed. Their disagreements remained professional, but they revealed two completely different ideas about leadership. Victoria Hayes observed these interactions with increasing curiosity. She admired Daniel's confidence, yet she also believed Richard's experience made him a valuable executive. Whenever conflicting opinions reached her office, she relied heavily on written reports and recommendations from senior leadership. She had not yet learned that polished presentations could sometimes hide uncomfortable truths. Outside the office, Daniel's priorities never changed. One Friday evening, he arrived at Jefferson Elementary just as parents gathered for the annual family science night. Sophie proudly led him through rows of student projects until she stopped beside a simple display built from recycled cardboard, small lights, and colorful paper stars. "It is a neighborhood power system," she explained with excitement. "If one house loses electricity, the others share until everyone is safe." "Dad, help me understand how it works." Daniel smiled and applauded as though he were standing before the greatest invention in the world. The judges awarded Sophie only an honorable mention, but Daniel celebrated as if she had won first place. "Doing your best lasts longer than winning a ribbon," he reminded her as they shared hot chocolate afterward. Standing across the crowded school cafeteria, an elderly woman quietly watched the father and daughter laughing together. She wore comfortable walking shoes, a gray sweater, and thick reading glasses that made her blend effortlessly into the crowd of grandparents attending the event. When Sophie accidentally dropped several science papers onto the floor, the woman knelt to help gather them. "You built something very clever," she told the little girl warmly. Sophie beamed with pride before introducing Daniel. He thanked the woman for her kindness, exchanged only a few friendly words, and continued helping Sophie pack her project into the pickup truck. He never noticed the black luxury sedan parked discreetly across the street or the professional driver waiting patiently behind the wheel. Inside the vehicle, another man quietly asked, "Would you like us to continue observing him, madam?" The elderly woman looked through the window as Daniel fastened Sophie's seat belt before carefully checking that her jacket was zipped against the chilly evening air. A gentle smile crossed her face. "Yes," she answered softly. "Character reveals itself through ordinary days, not extraordinary ones. We have only begun to learn who Daniel Brooks truly is." The following Monday began like every other busy morning at Hayes Technologies, but before the sun reached its highest point, one carefully planned lie had already started changing lives. Daniel Brooks arrived just before 8 o'clock carrying a travel mug of coffee and a folder containing final system verification reports for the upcoming investor demonstration. He greeted the reception staff by name, exchanged a few friendly words with the maintenance crew replacing ceiling lights in the lobby, and headed toward the engineering department without realizing that several members of the executive team had already gathered behind closed doors. Richard Coleman stood at the front of the conference room, presenting what appeared to be undeniable evidence. Large screens displayed security logs, access records, and confidential files that had supposedly been copied from protected servers during the previous weekend. Every document pointed toward a single employee identification number: Daniel's. Victoria Hayes studied the reports in silence. The timestamps appeared consistent. Digital signatures seemed authentic. Even the internal audit summary recommended immediate termination before the scheduled investor presentation. "If this reaches the media," Richard warned with measured confidence, "our reputation could suffer permanent damage. We have to act now." Victoria looked once more at Daniel's employee profile displayed beside the evidence. His performance reviews had been exceptional for years. There had never been a disciplinary complaint. Something about the situation felt unexpectedly out of character, but every document on the screen pushed her toward the same conclusion. Carrying the responsibility of protecting thousands of employees and the future of the company, she reluctantly approved the recommendation. Minutes later, Daniel was called into a private meeting. He entered expecting another technical discussion, but immediately sensed the unusual tension in the room. Human resources representatives sat quietly beside Richard, while Victoria remained standing near the window with a file held tightly in her hands. Richard explained the accusation in a calm, professional tone and slid several printed reports across the table. Daniel read every page carefully before lifting his eyes. "These records are wrong. he said evenly. "I did not copy those files, and I would never put this company at risk." Richard responded that the digital evidence spoke for itself. Victoria waited for Daniel to become angry or desperate, but instead, he simply asked one question. "Has anyone investigated whether these records could have been altered?" The room fell silent for only a moment before Richard answered that the internal investigation was complete. Daniel slowly nodded. He realized no one present intended to search any further. His thoughts turned not toward his career, but towards Sophie waiting after school, excited because they had planned to bake chocolate chip cookies together that evening. He refused to spend his final moments arguing with people who had already made their decision. Quietly collecting his family photograph and personal notebook, he thanked the coworkers who avoided meeting his eyes and walked toward the lobby. As the security officers accompanied him outside according to company procedure, dozens of employees watched from behind glass walls, unsure whether to believe the rumors or the man they had respected for years. High above the entrance, Victoria remained frozen beside the conference room window. Daniel never looked back at the building. He simply stepped into the steady October rain, carrying the small cardboard box that now held everything the company had left him. Watching him disappear across the crowded sidewalk, Victoria experienced a feeling she could not explain. It was not confidence. It was doubt, quiet and persistent, settling into her heart long before she understood how expensive that single signature would become. The days that followed moved with the quiet determination of a man who refused to let disappointment become his daughter's inheritance. Every morning Daniel Brooks woke before sunrise, prepared Sophie's breakfast, walked her to the school bus, and spent the rest of the day searching for work. He updated his resume, attended interviews, and accepted polite rejections that became more frequent as rumors about his dismissal spread through the local technology community. No one said the accusation directly, but the hesitation in hiring managers' voices told him enough. By late afternoon, he always returned home before Sophie did, making certain she never sensed the weight he carried. If she asked how his day had gone, he smiled and answered, "I learned something useful." It became their little tradition. She believed every difficult day was simply another lesson waiting to become tomorrow's success. Their savings slowly disappeared. Daniel canceled streaming subscriptions, postponed replacing the aging tires on his pickup truck, and found creative ways to stretch every grocery trip without allowing Sophie to feel deprived. She noticed the changes anyway. One evening, she quietly placed her allowance jar on the kitchen table. "We can use this until you get your new job," she said with complete sincerity. Daniel gently pushed it back toward her. "Your job is to keep dreaming big. Mine is to make sure you always have the chance." On his way home from another unsuccessful interview, Daniel passed the same downtown park where he had first noticed the elderly woman sitting alone on the weathered bench. Autumn leaves drifted across the sidewalk as a cold breeze swept through the nearly empty square. She was there again, wearing the same modest coat, reading a worn paperback novel with gloved hands. Daniel stopped at a nearby bakery and used part of the little cash remaining in his wallet to buy 2 bowls of hot soup and a fresh loaf of bread. Carrying the warm paper bag, he walked over with an easy smile. "I thought you might enjoy dinner with some company today," he said. The elderly woman looked up with genuine surprise. "You remembered me?" she asked softly. Daniel chuckled. "My daughter says it is hard to forget kind people." They shared this simple meal beneath a row of maple trees while talking about ordinary things. She asked whether he had found new work. Daniel admitted the search was taking longer than expected, but never mentioned the accusation that had cost him his career. Instead, he spoke proudly about Sophie, her love of science, and her dream of becoming an engineer one day. The elderly woman listened far more than she spoke, occasionally smiling at the quiet optimism that refused to leave his voice. Before leaving, Daniel folded his own scarf and placed it beside her. "The temperature is supposed to drop below 40 degrees tonight," he said. "Please keep this. I can always buy another one later." She hesitated. "And what will keep you warm?" Daniel glanced toward the fading sunset and smiled. Knowing someone else is not facing the cold alone helps more than you would think. He waved goodbye and walked toward his pickup truck without asking for thanks, a name, or anything in return. hidden behind the tinted windows of a black luxury sedan parked across the street. 2. Discreet security professionals watched in complete silence. The elderly woman climbed into the back seat moments later, removed her reading glasses, and looked at a thick folder resting beside her. Across the front, embossed in neat gold lettering, were the words, Daniel Brooks. Opening it slowly, she whispered, "He has passed every test that mattered. Now it is time to discover who failed him." While Daniel Brooks continued rebuilding his life one honest day at a time, quiet cracks began to appear inside Hayes Technologies. Victoria Hayes found herself returning again and again to the investigation file that had justified Daniel's dismissal. She had reviewed thousands of reports since becoming chief executive officer, yet this one refused to leave her thoughts. Daniel had never pleaded for sympathy. He had never blamed another employee. Most of all, he had asked only one question before leaving the company. Had anyone verified whether the records themselves had been altered? At the time, she had accepted Richard Coleman's assurance that every possibility had already been examined. Now that answer no longer satisfied her. Early one morning, before the rest of the executive team arrived, Victoria requested direct access to the original cybersecurity logs instead of the summarized reports. The company's information security manager hesitated before explaining that some archive system records had been excluded because they were considered unnecessary after the investigation concluded. Victoria quietly instructed him to restore every archived file anyway. "I want the complete timeline," she said, "not the convenient one." Hours later, as technicians reconstructed the original server activity, an unexpected pattern emerged. Several administrative records had been modified only minutes before the final investigation report had been generated. Even more troubling, those modifications had originated from credentials with executive-level authorization that Daniel had never possessed. The information security manager frowned at the monitor. "These timestamps do not match the report submitted to Human Resources," he admitted carefully. Victoria felt a chill despite the warm office. She asked one question that no one in the room could immediately answer. Who had permission to make these changes? At nearly the same time, inside a quiet private office overlooking Boston Harbor, the elderly woman Daniel believed to be an ordinary stranger sat across from a team of attorneys, forensic accountants, and digital investigators. Gone were the worn coat and reading glasses. Eleanor Whitmore now appeared exactly as she truly was, composed, confident, and unmistakably powerful. A large portrait of the founder of Whitmore Global Industries hung behind her desk, a reminder that the multinational investment company she had built now held controlling ownership in dozens of corporations, including Hayes Technologies. A senior investigator placed several folders on the conference table. "Our independent review found no evidence that Daniel Brooks accessed or removed confidential research files," he reported. "However, we have identified irregular activity involving executive authorization credentials and financial transactions connected to several senior managers." Eleanor listened without interrupting. She had spent decades building businesses, and experience had taught her that numbers often revealed truths people try to hide. She slowly opened another folder containing photographs taken over the past several weeks. Every image showed Daniel doing something that offered him no personal benefit: helping neighbors carry groceries, reading with Sophie at the public library, delivering food to the local community shelter, sharing warm meals with a lonely elderly woman he believed had nothing to offer him in return. Eleanor rested one hand gently on the photographs before looking toward the lead investigator. "Continue gathering evidence," she instructed calmly. "When the truth comes forward, it must be complete enough that no honest person can ever question it again." As evening settled over the city, Victoria stared silently at the restored system logs glowing across her computer screen while Eleanor closed the final investigation folder with quiet certainty. Neither woman had spoken to Daniel that day, yet both had reached the same unsettling conclusion. The man everyone believed had betrayed the company had instead become the victim of a far more carefully planned deception. The quarterly board meeting at Hayes Technologies was expected to be a celebration of record growth. But by the time the final agenda appeared on the screen, the atmosphere inside the executive conference room had become unusually tense. Directors from across the country filled every seat around the long, polished table, while senior executives quietly reviewed financial reports that suddenly seemed less important than the confidential message every board member had received only an hour earlier. Victoria Hayes remained composed, although she had barely slept the night before. The restored system logs, the inconsistencies uncovered by the cybersecurity team, and the unanswered questions surrounding Daniel Brooks weighed heavily on her conscience. Richard Coleman appeared confident as always, greeting directors with practiced smiles, unaware that events had already begun moving beyond his control. Just as the meeting officially opened, the conference room doors swung quietly inward. Every conversation stopped. An elegant elderly woman entered wearing a tailored navy suit instead of the weathered coat everyone would have associated with a quiet stranger. She carried herself with effortless confidence earned through decades of leadership rather than wealth alone. Several directors immediately rose to their feet. Others exchanged surprised glances before following. Victoria stood as well, recognizing the woman only from portraits displayed in annual corporate reports. Eleanor Whitmore had arrived in person. Richard's confident expression disappeared for the first time. Eleanor walked calmly to the head of the table, thanked the directors for their patience, and placed a slim leather folder before her. "Before we discuss quarterly performance," she said in a calm voice that required no microphone, "we must first discuss integrity." The room became perfectly silent. Eleanor explained that as founder of Whitmore Global Industries, the majority investment company behind Hayes Technologies, she had ordered an independent review after receiving information that raised concerns about the recent internal investigation involving Daniel Brooks. Without raising her voice or accusing anyone personally, she invited the company's forensic technology specialists to display their findings. The large presentation screen, illuminated with restored server records, verified security logs, and authenticated audit trails that had never appeared in the original investigation report. Each slide revealed the same conclusion. Daniel had never accessed the confidential research files he was accused of stealing. Instead, multiple administrative records had been altered using executive-level authorization after the original data had already been recorded. Additional evidence demonstrated coordinated attempts to redirect responsibility away from the individuals who had manipulated the system. Richard's face gradually lost its color as every document presented erased the foundation of the accusation he had championed. Victoria lowered her eyes for a brief moment, realizing that Daniel had spoken the truth during his final meeting, and she had failed to listen. Eleanor then opened another folder containing photographs that surprised everyone in the room. Instead of technical evidence, the images showed Daniel helping neighbors, volunteering in the community, encouraging his young daughter, and quietly sharing meals with an elderly woman during the most difficult weeks of his life. "Character cannot be manufactured by public relations," Eleanor said gently. "It is revealed by the choices people make when no reward is expected." She paused before looking directly at every member of the board. Daniel Brooks lost his career because honest people accepted incomplete evidence. That mistake ends today. One director slowly broke the silence by asking the question everyone had been avoiding. "Where is Mr. Brooks now?" Victoria looked toward the rain-covered windows overlooking Boston and answered softly, almost to herself, "Probably doing exactly what he was doing before we failed him, taking care of his daughter." For the first time since signing the termination papers, she understood that restoring Daniel's job would never be enough. She would first have to restore the trust that her own decision had taken away. By the following afternoon, every employee at Hayes Technologies had received an unexpected company-wide invitation requesting their attendance in the main auditorium. Rumors spread through every department as hundreds of people quietly filled the seats, wondering why the entire executive leadership team had been assembled with almost no advance notice. Victoria Hayes stood alone behind the podium, holding a single page of prepared remarks she no longer intended to read. For the first time since becoming chief executive officer, she understood that leadership did not begin with protecting authority. It began with accepting responsibility. She looked across the audience before speaking. Several weeks ago, this company failed one of its own employees. The responsibility for that failure ultimately belongs to me. The room became completely silent. Victoria openly explained that an independent investigation had proven Daniel Brooks innocent of every allegation that led to his dismissal. She acknowledged that incomplete evidence had been accepted without sufficient verification and announced that every executive involved in manipulating or approving the false investigation had been removed from positions of authority pending the completion of all remaining legal and corporate procedures. New policies would immediately require independent technical reviews before any employee could face disciplinary action based on digital evidence alone. Anonymous reporting protections would also be expanded so that honest employees could speak without fear of retaliation. When the announcement ended, there was no applause. Only thoughtful silence filled the auditorium. Victoria accepted it because she knew trust could never be restored by words alone. That evening, she drove alone to the quiet neighborhood where Daniel lived. She carried no cameras, no public relations staff, and no prepared speech. In her hands was a simple envelope containing a formal letter restoring his professional reputation, full compensation for lost wages and benefits, and an invitation to return whenever and if ever he believed the company deserved another chance. Daniel answered the door wearing an old flannel shirt dusted with flour after spending the evening baking cookies with Sophie. The warm smell of cinnamon drifted through the house. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Victoria looked directly into his eyes. "I came here because I owe you the truth, not because I expect forgiveness." She admitted that she had relied on authority instead of evidence, and had mistaken confidence for careful leadership. Daniel listened quietly without interrupting. When she finished, he thanked her for coming, but did not immediately accept the envelope. "Losing my job hurt," he said calmly. "Watching my daughter wonder why people stopped believing in her father hurt much more." Victoria lowered her eyes, unable to argue with words she knew were deserved. Just then, Sophie stepped into the hallway, carrying a plate of freshly baked chocolate chip cookies. Recognizing the visitor from the company photograph she had once seen in Daniel's office, she smiled politely and offered the plate. "Dad says nobody should have to make important decisions on an empty stomach." Victoria hesitated before accepting a cookie, unexpectedly moved by the kindness of a child whose family had every reason to turn her away. She quietly thanked Sophie, then placed the envelope on the small table near the front door. "Whether you ever return or not," she said softly, "I promise that what happened to you will never happen to another employee if I can prevent it." Daniel watched her leave without making any promises. Through the front window, he saw her pause beside her car for a long moment, taking a deep breath before driving away into the evening. Across the street, unnoticed by either of them, Eleanor Whitmore observed everything from the back seat of her waiting sedan. A gentle smile appeared as she whispered to herself, "Now the real work of earning forgiveness can finally begin." Several months passed before Daniel Brooks finally accepted an invitation to walk through the front doors of Hayes Technologies again. But this time the atmosphere felt completely different. No security officers waited in the lobby. No whispered rumors followed him through the hallways. Instead, employees who remembered his kindness greeted him with genuine smiles, and many quietly thanked him for returning. Daniel had not come back because of a higher salary or a larger office. He had returned because he believed good companies, like good people, deserve the opportunity to learn from their mistakes. Victoria Hayes met him personally at the entrance instead of waiting in the executive suite. She extended her hand with quiet respect rather than executive authority. "Welcome back, Daniel," she said sincerely. "I hope we can earn your trust one day at a time." Daniel shook her hand with a calm smile. "Trust grows the same way great engineering does," he replied, one solid decision after another. His new role focused on leading the company's innovation and systems integrity division, where he worked closely with engineers to strengthen both technology and ethical safeguards throughout the organization. The reforms Victoria had promised became permanent. Every internal investigation required independent technical verification. Employee concerns received confidential review by teams outside executive management. Promotions increasingly reflected integrity as much as performance. Gradually, the culture inside Hayes Technologies began changing in ways quarterly reports could never fully measure. Outside the office, life also found a peaceful new rhythm. Victoria occasionally visited Daniel's neighborhood, never announcing her arrival and never discussing business unless he asked. Sometimes she brought science books for Sophie. Other times, she joined them at local community events where no one cared about job titles. Sophie slowly grew comfortable around her, not because anyone encouraged it, but because Victoria consistently showed up with patience, honesty, and genuine interest in the little girl's dreams. One Saturday afternoon, they volunteered together at a neighborhood food pantry. As families packed grocery boxes for local seniors, Sophie looked up at Victoria with a bright smile. "Dad says helping people is easier when everyone works together." Victoria smiled warmly. "Your father has been teaching me that lesson for quite some time." Across the room, Daniel overheard the conversation and realized that real change had taken place not through dramatic promises, but through dozens of small choices repeated over many weeks. Later that evening, Daniel, Sophie, Victoria, and Eleanor Whitmore shared dinner at a quiet restaurant overlooking Boston Harbor. For the first time, Eleanor spoke openly about the reason she had hidden her identity. "Success tells you who admires your wealth," she said gently. "Humility tells you who values your humanity." I want to know which kind of man Daniel truly was before placing my confidence in him. Daniel smiled modestly. "Only share a meal with someone who looked hungry." Eleanor nodded with quiet satisfaction. "Exactly. You helped because it was right, not because it was useful." As the sun slowly disappeared beyond the harbor, Sophie reached across the table and slipped her small hand into Daniel's. Victoria smiled at the simple moment, understanding that families were not built by perfect beginnings, but by honest hearts willing to grow together. Daniel looked around the table and realized that losing his job had once seemed like the worst day of his life, yet it had quietly opened the door to a future he could never have imagined. Sometimes the greatest blessings arrived, disguised as unfair endings, and sometimes the person capable of changing everything first appeared as someone the world had almost forgotten. In the end, Daniel's name had been cleared, justice had been restored, and every life touched by one simple act of kindness had become richer in the only way that truly mattered.